30 years after the USSR's collapse, Russia remains a magnet for migrants from the former Soviet Union. Russia counts its population as about 145 million, and the number of migrants reaches into the millions as well, peaking at 12 million in the early 2010s. Why do migrants from post-Soviet countries come to Russia? Does Russia need labor migrants? What kind of employment can migrants count on in Russia? These are the topics this video will address. Out of all the post-Soviet states except for the Baltics, Russia has the highest standard of living. Like many countries, Russia is experiencing a labor shortage due to its aging population and low birth rate. The new migration history of post-Soviet Russia and of other post-Soviet states begins in 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the transformation of its constituent republics into independent states. In the 1990s, a large flow of migrants from former Soviet republics flocked to Russia. Most of them were ethnic Russians, referred to as compatriots, who were fleeing the nation-states taking shape in the territory of the former Soviet Union. Others were driven to Russia by economic hardship and political turmoil. Others were fleeing armed conflict. In Russia, most of them could find only manual labor. In the 2000s, dire economic straits were the main cause, driving migrants out of their countries. They went to Russia to provide for their families left at home. Immediately after the collapse of the USSR, migrants from ex-Soviet countries still shared a common history with Russia. Most of them spoke good Russian and not infrequently had personal ties to people in Russia. During that early period, migrants mostly came from urban regions. This has changed in later years. Today's migrants tend to be rural rather than urban. They are less educated, often don't speak Russian, and no longer think of Russia as their country. The largest numbers of labor migrants are concentrated in the Central Federal District. Almost half of all labor migrants working in Russia are employed here. Over one-third are employed in Moscow, a modern megalopolis with well-developed construction and service sectors and its surrounding regions. The Northwestern Federal District, mainly the St. Petersburg and Leningrad regions, absorb about 15% of labor migrants. Some other regions attractive for labor migrants include the energy-rich Khanty-Mansyukra, a small region in northern Russia with gigantic oil and gas resources, and Krasnodar Krai in the south, which has a warm climate and a highly developed agricultural industry. Construction has the highest concentration of migrant labor. 15% of those employed in construction are foreigners. In recent years, the number of migrants in the service sector has been steadily growing as well. The COVID-19 pandemic greatly affected migrant employment. The construction industry has experienced a labor shortage because many foreign laborers returned to their home countries. Meanwhile, the rapidly developing service sector offers many new jobs for cab drivers and delivery men. Walking along a street in Moscow these days, one is sure to see not one, but several delivery men wearing brightly colored uniforms and riding bicycles. Citizens of some former Soviet states, such as Azerbaijan, Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Tajikistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan, can enter Russia visa-free. But while entering Russia may not be a problem, receiving the legal status of a migrant worker is. Economic factors, such as labor shortages in construction, conflict with political factors, such as the government's desire to cater to xenophobic sentiments by curtailing the number of migrants. As a result, the government's migration policy is being constantly revised. Migrants do not know what new regulations will be introduced. The existing regulations are frequently amended, and practical enforcement is often at variance with migration laws.
When we look at the migration situation from the state perspective, we see not only a lack of sympathy for what migrants face, but even a general ignorance of what their difficulties are. Government decision makers know that the country needs migrants, but that the population is pretty reluctant to have them. We can call this a structural contradiction between need and want, and that is the space that policymakers have to work in. This is true of many, many immigrant receiving countries, and it's in this space that different state agencies create policies, goals, and targets that they then enforce and measure through their own work, which basically only identifies the migrants that they want to see. So, for example, when Kyrgyzstan joined the Eurasian Economic Union, it meant that their citizens could work in Russia without a labor permit. But as a result, the government doesn't record Kyrgyz labor migrants into the official data on foreign workers. We also don't have good estimates on the number of undocumented migrants in the country, in part because to remain legal, there is a web of interlocking documents that require migrants' constant attention so that they don't expire. Nevertheless, the state uses the data that it produces to evaluate its own work and policies, and more often than not, it comes to believe that it's doing a pretty good job by just tweaking policies here and there. This is, of course, a short-sighted view of the government's own creation, and indeed, it does create a volatile and reactive policy space where rules are frequently changing as the government tinkers.
Today, many migrants do not have legal status. They work illegally. This is either because legalization is too expensive or because employers are unwilling to make formal contracts with migrants. Labor migrants often find themselves in hard living conditions. Healthcare programs for migrants are lacking. They often can't afford even minimal medical insurance and therefore can only count on emergency care. There are no government programs providing housing for migrants. As a rule, they live in rented apartments with several people sharing a room, or they pay for beds in commercial dormitories. Construction workers live in shacks. Labor migrants' children can, theoretically, attend school, but their parents must have a residence registration in order for them to enroll. Since landlords are often unwilling to register migrants, migrant children may be left without this document and thus without the ability to enroll.
Migration is entangled in a number of moral hazards in Russia, even more so than in other migrant-receiving countries. Everywhere, migrant management is a pretty sinister and dehumanizing business. But in Russia, not only is there a lack of concept that migrants have rights that the state should be involved in protecting, but the moral hazard takes on an additional salience because through corruption, state actors themselves drive the precarity that migrants experience. Now, it's important to say that not every state agent and not every migrant engages in corruption. Nevertheless, we don't have to have uniform participation to conclude that corruption is systemic or enmeshed in normal ways of getting things done. So, for example, we often hear stories of police officers arresting or threatening to arrest migrants for violations that may be real, but may be fabricated. In many cases, a cash payment will immediately solve the problem. Another type of corruption occurs when migrants are forced to pay for services that should be free, such as getting a ticket to get a place in line for administrative services, or when migrants who are being deported are only given the option to buy their plane ticket home at inflated prices. We don't know how often these types of interactions occur. We don't know what proportion of migrants experience this type of exploitation, but we do know that these are powerful human experiences that leave their mark on individual migrants and migrant communities, and that the power differential between migrants and state agents in many cases means that migrants just try to minimize their losses and find ways to avoid the state altogether.
When people are asked by pollsters about their attitude towards migrants, they usually think of migrant workers from Central Asia and Transcaucasia. These groups are visible migrants because they look different. Xenophobia is not uncommon in Russia. Landlords offering apartments for rent often add "only for Slavs" or "only for Russians." A special ban introduced in 2021 forbids such discriminatory restrictions, but the fact that such a ban needed to be adopted indicates that racial prejudice is common. According to a national poll conducted in late 2021, over half of Russians believe that there are too many labor migrants in their locality. Ethnic clashes are infrequent. However, xenophobic passions occasionally lead to violence. In Russia, as in many other countries, the problem of migrants is a political issue that is often used in election campaigns. Labor migrants commonly experience discrimination in the job market. They are paid lower wages, work longer hours, and are often left unregistered or illegal by their employers. Racial profiling by the police is common. Law enforcement officers routinely get away with corruption and abuse of authority. Nonprofit organizations rendering legal assistance to migrants are almost non-existent. Гражданское содействие is the only exception. It is not uncommon for Russians to believe that migrants can and should be replaced by Russian citizens. Over 50% voiced this opinion in a recent national poll. Studies invariably show, however, that migrants occupy employment niches associated with low pay and hard labor. These professions are unattractive to Russian residents. The demographic situation in Russia, namely the decline in young people of working age, makes labor migrants indispensable. During the COVID pandemic, when many migrant workers left Russia, it became clear that some industries, construction in particular, cannot do without them. Will the current inflow of migrants from former Soviet states to Russia remain in place for years to come? The answer is no. Migrants from Eastern European countries, such as Ukraine and Moldova, tend to turn westward in search of employment, attracted to the higher pay and better legal and working conditions that they expect to find there. Migrants from Transcaucasia and Central Asia are increasingly attracted to countries such as Turkey, United Arab Emirates, and South Korea, where they can count on higher pay. For the new generation of migrant workers, factors like a shared Soviet past and a knowledge of Russian language or culture, both of which were important to their parents' generation, are becoming less and less significant. Since the migration flow from the former Soviet states will gradually deplete, Russia will have to begin trying to attract migrants. This could mean simplifying their path to legal participation in the labor market, or offering them better living conditions. In 10 years' time, will labor migrants from the former Soviet states still be looking to Russia for employment opportunities? Currently, the answer is unclear.
The war in Ukraine has made a huge impact on the world and also on migration to Russia. For labor migrants from Central Asia in particular, the impact is economic for certain, but it also creates an ethical dilemma. The conversation about the war in Ukraine is much more diverse in Central Asia than it is in Russia. And since many migrants get their news and other information through social networks, it means that they are likely better informed than the average Russian citizen. Many Central Asians are opposed to Russia's war on Ukraine. There's a sort of post-colonial solidarity among the countries that comprised the periphery of the Soviet Union. As a result, migrants can feel stuck with the need to earn money in an increasingly constrained economy and the desire to wash their hands of the war. Many migrants simply don't know where else to go. Some migrants, though, are signing up for the army to go fight for Russia in Ukraine. There seems to be cases where serving in the military has provided foreigners access to citizenship, though human rights advocates are warning it is a dangerous and insecure path. Another important effect of the war on migration is Ukrainian citizens moving into Russia. The government has provisions for this group. Their Slavic faces are generally preferred over the visible others from Central Asia. But what we've seen is that it can be bureaucratically challenging to access the privileges of being a Ukrainian refugee. In many cases, Ukrainians legalize their status through the same labor migration procedures as migrants from Central Asia, or they just go undocumented altogether.